Back when I was 21 years old, I was a strategic firearms commander. This meant that I led a team into dangerous situations that oftentimes involves hostages or civilians who carried guns or other deadly weapons. I had a second-in-command firearms commander working beside me. His name was Callum, and he was my best friend. We always hung out outside of work. While on duty, he would always joke around and make us crack a smile, even when we were dealing with pretty distressful stuff. We once had a case where a man had possession of a firearm, and we were assigned to take care of it. Callum seemed particularly eager and jumped out of the van before it even came to a full stop. When the rest of the team reached the scene, the man was already shot. Callum still had the gun in his hand. Soon after, I asked Callum why he was so eager to do it. And then he said he had no specific reason. He was just excited. I believed him because he was my best friend. Later on, when I was looking at the man who was shot, I looked him up on social media and realized that he and Callum added each other on Facebook. Upon further investigation, I realized that there were thousands of messages sent between the two where Callum revealed sensitive information about several operations. I knew that he killed this man on purpose, but I had no way of proving it. He was taken to court and was sentenced to 3 years in jail for perverting the court of justice. I testified against him and was no longer his friend. When I was 24 years old, I was still on the firearms team. All that happened with Callum was behind me, and I was happy with my life. One night I went home really late after work. As I walked to my apartment, I realized that it was trashed. I called the police and they reported it, but there was not much they could do because I didn't have a CCTV. As I got into bed, I saw that there was a note on my bedside table. All it said was, "Remember me?" I instantly recognized Callum's handwriting. And now that he was out of prison, I thought that he would move on with his life. I was so wrong. This was his revenge. The next day, I went to the underground parking lot and I saw that my windscreen was smashed. It was clear that he wasn't over me testifying against him. Soon after, I also saw him near my apartment. I ran after him, but he ignored me and ran away. I tried calling his old number, but it was no longer in service. Then an envelope was sent through my door, and it contained hundreds of photos of me at work, home, and even out with my girlfriend at clubs and restaurants. These were all taken very recently. The last one, though, was a picture of Callum and I from years ago, and on the other side, written with a big red marker, were the words, "You're dead." I reported this as stalking and hoped he would end up back in prison. The police had gone to his listed address, but there was no one there. In fact, all of his bags were packed. I knew he was still in the area somewhere, though. One day I was by myself in an unmarked car, and I saw this Toyota Yaris, and it was driving close behind me. It was my gut instinct to get the plate number checked, and I was going to. But then I got a Priority 1 announcement on the radio saying there was a crazy man on a bus who had a knife and stabbed someone. I turned on my sirens and blue lights and headed to the accident. As I got on the bus, he was already arrested, and the ambulance was already there as well. As I was about to leave the bus, I heard a loud bang, and a man on the bus fell down. He was shot through the window by a man who was wearing a black hoodie. He immediately ran. I ran out of the bus and went to the boot of my car. I got my MP5 SF out, which was a large rifle with sniper capabilities. I ran after the suspect and radioed in. They gave me an order of critical shot, which meant I could shoot to kill the suspect. He ran through the town center and went to the left. I was worried about public safety as he had a large rifle as well. I realized instead of running after him, I needed to get on a roof and shoot down. I went to this building that had views of the right and left. It took me 5 minutes, and I was worried that he would have run away by now. As I got to the roof, I turned my gun to the sniper level. I used the eyepiece to scan, and I saw a man in a black hoodie running. I fired a shot, and he fell to the ground. By the time I got there, more armed policemen came to the area. I was shocked to see Callum. He was the one who followed me in the car behind me, and that shot in the bus was meant for me. But he missed. Callum was dead. I felt sad, but also relieved that this was all over. The man shot on the bus survived, and I was promoted for my diligent work. I'm still working in the force.
This happened when I was in college. I was 20 at the time, studying for an upcoming exam in biology. That is, until my roommate busted in my room. She wasn't yelling, but I could see she was drunk by her excitement. I rolled my eyes and sighed. I completely lost focus now. But it was okay. I kind of gotten used to her behavior. She was a party girl while I was, well, a nerd. I tried to get back on my reading tracks again, but she patted me on the back and drunkenly giggled before speaking. "Come on, Jasmine. Every time I see you, you're always reading a book." I sighed before speaking. "And every time I see you, you smell of alcohol and vomit." She frowned at me. "How about this? I'll be quiet all week if you come to this party tomorrow at 8. I wanted to say no, but then I thought about it. I mean, I do always work really hard. Besides, she won't barge in like this for the whole week? Sounds too good, I thought to myself, so I nodded and continued to read. We got ready. I hadn't dressed up in ages, so I was kind of excited. The party was loud, filled with drunk people making out, bumping, and dancing. The party was hosted in a basement-like setting, only it was much bigger and had a lot of space. I'm not going to lie, I did have a few drinks. I wasn't drunk, but I was definitely tipsy. So, as my view became tilted, this guy comes out of nowhere and has small talk with me. He was fairly attractive. He didn't seem drunk. We met and exchanged names. From what I remember, he had red dyed hair and blue eyes. He was white and about 6 feet. His name was Luke. We laughed and talked about topics like studying and books and that kind of thing. The talking went on for about a half an hour. He then said, "Hey, I'm going to get another drink. Want anything?" And I said, "Why not? I mean, I'm having fun." So later on, he came back with drinks. And the next thing I remember, we were making out in the corner of the party room. It was so quick, and then he asked me, "Want to go back to my place?" Which I politely declined. I already know what he wants. Besides, I needed to be on campus in the morning. "Come on, I promise it will be fun." I remember that he kept on trying to get me to go, but he gave up after I made it clear I wasn't interested in going to his place. He rolled his eyes angrily and gave me a paper with a number on it. "Fine. If you change your mind, give me a call." He leaned close to me and whispered against my ear. Then he walked out, and the rest of the night was a complete blank. The next day, I woke up inside my college bedroom, on my bed, next to my roommate snoring on her bed as well. As I got up to shower, a paper fell out of my pocket. It was the number, which made me remember that guy. But I had more important things now. I showered then and went to study. I remember reading my book when all of a sudden I felt dizzy. Then I woke up in the bed with police officers and nurses talking next to me. Turns out I had this dangerous allergic reaction that could only be caused from saliva or any bodily fluids that had come from decaying or rotting flesh. Which to my surprise was weird. I hadn't been kissing anyone, let alone ate anything raw. Then I remembered the guy. I told the police about the guy at the party and gave them the number he gave me. A few weeks passed and my allergies went down so I could live my life normally. I just finished my test when my phone rang. I answered it and it was the police. Turns out the guy from the party had 2 dead, decaying women's bodies inside his apartment that he ate. They must have been there for months. My heart dropped. The thought that I made out with someone who ate human flesh, or even worse, was what if I had agreed to come to his place? I may have been one of those bodies.
This fact happened when I was 15 years old, beginning of last year, 2018, when I finally got to sophomore year here in Brazil. It was an ordinary Friday night. Suddenly, I felt a little bit hungry, so I decided to put on some clothes and go to the snack bar. It was barely 10 minutes from my house. I usually pass through the alley to go to the snack bar, but that time, everything was so creepy in there. When I was halfway there, it was dark, empty, abnormally cold and gloomy. I felt slightly intimidated, but there was nothing there that could really harm me. So I decided to just go through that alley. Then I thought, nothing's gonna happen. I kept going until I suddenly heard something weird on the other side of the alley. There was a man in there, staring at the walls in hunchback stance, grunting weirdly. I found that incredibly creepy, but I was nearly at the snack bar, so all I needed was just to get out of that alley. Walk 1 minute more and I finally would get there, instead of making it all the way home with empty hands. Thus, I decided to ignore him and pass through after all. I finally passed through him. He turned to me and stared at me with a creepy smile, which made me walk a little bit faster, trying to avoid him. Then, suddenly, I heard a grunt and quick steps behind me. When I looked back, it was him. We were barely 2 feet away from each other. He had a kitchen knife in his right hand and jumped on me with amazing speed and tried to stab me. I managed to grab both of his arms before he could get me. However, since he was charging at me, he still had more energy to push me back and force me against a wall. I was terrified with all of that. I knew I would die if I didn't fight back. Back then, I was already trained in some martial arts to defend myself, but that I thought I'd never need to use that skill to defend my life until now. So, in a sudden burst of adrenaline, I managed to twist the wrist which he was holding the knife, kicking his stomach and punching him mercilessly in the face several times. In the end, his face was bleeding so much, but his body was ignoring the pain of the blows in his body and only focusing on killing me. Finally, I used a training that I took before to twist both of his wrists and elbows harshly at the same time, forced in 2 different directions, and kicked the backside of his leg, putting him to the ground until ultimately he could drop the knife. It wasn't easy because he was struggling and punching my back and somehow trying to jump on me. But since I had his arm under my grasp, he couldn't do much without breaking himself. I slammed his head in the concrete ground, stunning him, then kept striking his face desperately while kneeling over his arm so he wouldn't be able to react or reach his knife again. And finally, he was out cold, bleeding a lot. My knuckles were full of blood and hurt. So I got up, took his knife, throwing it far away from there, and ran away from him. I finally got to the snack bar, washed my hands in there, and did everything I had to do before going back home. But obviously, I didn't take the same path as I did before. But there were things that got much creepier. That was at the entrance of my apartment, where I heard screams coming from the other side of the street. It was the same crazy man. Now, seeming like he was possessed by a demon, and he was slamming his head on the iron door of my building's entrance. His face was horribly deformed and scarred from our fight. That freaked me out completely. My parents were on a trip, and the watchman of our building was on vacation. I wasn't going to fight that man again, so I decided to rush to my girlfriend's house. When I got there, she was home alone. She looked worried because I was looking pale, and there were still some marks of the man's blood on my clothes. I explained everything to her, and we called the police to come by my building. And when they arrived, the man was still in the entrance trying to force the doors unsuccessfully. When he saw the police, he attacked them, but got quickly dominated by the cops. They explained that he was probably a crazy psycho in the streets looking for prey to rape, kill, or do anything he wanted to the person. So they sent him to a high-security mental asylum for criminals far away from my house. I feel so lucky that I survived that day, and I'm hoping that I will never see that man again.
I laid poolside, perfecting my tan for the start of school next month. Mom was in the kitchen, cooking her famous fettuccine alfredo, and Dad was on the way home with a movie from Redbox. My life was perfect, but everything was about to change with the arrival of a new neighbor next door. He was a former police officer, probably mid-50s, possessed a firm drill sergeant-like tone, but was very friendly and talkative. Initially, he seemed like a good fit for the neighborhood. He was cordial, always made an effort to wave or say hi, and the presence of someone with a law enforcement background provided a sense of security. But everything began to unravel quickly, and the catalyst seemed to be me. My neighbor took a sudden and keen interest in me. Whenever I went outside, I could feel his eyes examining me. He would always wander over and try to start conversations with me, but as soon as he heard or saw my parents, he would leave. He asked me if I had any social media accounts. When I lied and said no, he asked if he could take a picture of me and proceeded to snap a pic before I could reply. I felt completely unnerved and frightened about his intentions for me. For all I knew, that we could have a murderer or pedophile living a mere feet from our home. I knew I had to delve deeper, so one night I aimed my telescope at his window, and what I saw only amplified the alarm bells going off in my head. The man was fixated on the picture of me on his phone, and I could even see a small stack of photos on his nightstand, a young girl's image on top. My blood ran cold, as this all but confirmed my fear. He must be a pedophile. The next night, I saw him sneakily rummaging through our trash can. I watched in horror and disbelief as he removed my used tampon, got into his car, and sped off in the night. This was the final straw. I knew that in the morning, I would have to alert my parents and get in contact with the police. And next morning, I awoke to the sound of police sirens and a loud commotion downstairs. I hopped out of bed and saw my parents being taken away in handcuffs. I started screaming and crying as I rushed towards the door, but I was stopped by the neighbor. With a horrified expression, he muttered, "I'm so sorry. Those aren't your real parents. You were kidnapped and missing the past 14 years. DNA test confirmed it."
It was on Friday night. I was finishing the last deliveries that I worked for. I was headed to the bar that I would usually go to every night to grab a glass of wine. I noticed there was a new bar that had recently opened, a kilometer away from the usual bar, so I decided to try it out. When I arrived and pushed the entrance door, I noticed something very weird. There were only 5 people inside, and they were all dressed in Halloween costumes, like vampire, ghost, werewolf, witch, and black magician. I felt really uncomfortable because I was the only ordinary person there, and also because Halloween was over 2 days ago. I was still awkwardly standing there blocking the entrance when all of a sudden, all the people started staring at me as if I had done something terribly wrong. I made my move and walked over to the bartender. The bartender looked almost like a real executioner. He asked me rudely in a gruff voice, "What do you want to sacrifice, blood or flesh?" Well, that creeped the hell out of me, but I thought this was his way of taking a Halloween order of alcohol. So I requested to him, "1 glass of blood, please." He turned around, grabbed a wine bottle, and poured it into a wine glass. Later, he opened a drawer and took out a black satanic pentagram necklace. He dipped the necklace 3 times while muttering something into my drink. To my surprise, the wine turned black in color, and he placed the glass on the table and told me to drink it in 1 shot. I was really thirsty at that moment, so I took the glass and drank it completely. It was quite strong, and my vision was slowly starting to blur. I paid the bartender and left the bar immediately. While I was walking, I started to feel dizzy, and my vision was worsening. I wasn't focused on where I was going, as my mind was in a vision of all the faces of all the people I saw in that bar, maniacally laughing and giggling at me. All of a sudden, I had already arrived home during my vision. At first, I was relieved, but when I closed the door behind me and turned around, I knew that I was in the wrong house. It was completely abandoned, cold, gloomy, and barely lit with the rays of moonlight. I tried to open the door, but it was totally locked. Right when I was going to run into the door to break it, I heard the upper wooden ceiling was creaking, as if someone was up there walking slowly, step by step. I was really afraid as I had no weapon to protect myself. I tried to call 911, but had no reachable service to call. My only option was to go upstairs and find my way out. I carefully walked upstairs and reached the top. To my left was a dead end, but to my right, I saw a hallway with 3 doors on each side. I opened the doors one by one to find nothing but dark, empty rooms and no way to escape. Finally, when I opened the 6th door, I saw a pentagram was drawn on the floor with 5 candles around, touching all 5 corners of the star. This sent me back to where the bartender dipped a necklace with the same symbol into my drink, and there was a figure floating vertically right above the symbol below. But the light provided by the candles was not enough for me to figure out what was floating. Accidentally, I dropped my phone on the old wooden floor, which created a loud sound. The figure was slowly advancing to my direction. I quickly backed off and hit my head against a wall behind. That figure, I can't forget it. My body was completely paralyzed when I saw that the same bartender at the bar was this guy. He was still dressed as an executioner and faced my powerless body. To make matters worse, the doors of the empty room started opening on their own, one by one, and out came all of the 5 people I saw at the bar. They were all laughing at me to the point I passed out. Then I heard silence. Then I woke up and realized that I was in a hospital. I asked one of the nurses what was going on. She told me that a group of teenagers saw me walking out of the forest and then walking to the abandoned house. They tried calling out to me, but I didn't respond nor look at them. Then the group saw me entering the house, and when they tried to open the door, it was locked. And so they called 911 thinking that I was trapped in that house. 30 minutes later, the police staff arrived and broke open the door and found me unconscious lying on the floor. They brought me into the hospital and were trying to investigate what had happened in that abandoned house. Later, I told police officers the whole story when they came to ask, but they didn't seem to believe me, while some of them were laughing, thinking that I was making it up. After that, I went home and directly went to sleep. The next morning, I hurried to the bathroom because I had to vomit very badly. And after I did, I noticed that my vomit was black. To forget things, I tried taking a cold shower. And when I was showering, I felt a sharp sting on my back. Then, when I changed the water temperature from cold to warm, the sting started to feel even more painful. I turned back with my head, barely making it to see behind. Then I was shocked for life. I had the same satanic pentagram carved on my back, which was surely done by a sharp object. From then on, I never went to a bar again.
I was a big Tinder guy a few years ago. Everywhere I went, I would update my location and then update, my body count. Then I quit doing Tinder and stuck with Instagram. I know they're completely different, and IG has a bunch of fake accounts. So I saw this girl commenting on all of my friends' pictures. Then she commented on mine. I also saw my friends replying, so I figured she was a real person because I looked on her page and she had way more followers than people she was following. So I DM'd her. I definitely thought she wasn't going to reply, but she did within an hour. We talked for maybe 2 or 3 weeks and we made it official. She was pretty, had a degree, and a good job, as she said. I felt she was out of my league and too perfect. Every day she posted new photos, and I told my friends about her and they seemed pretty jealous, except for my friend Ryan. He said I was stupid because I never spoke with her. and I only messaged her. She invited me over because she said she can cook. Ryan told me to don't go. The rest of my friends said don't have any kids and they would laugh. So I went over there, but not without Ryan calling me a clown first. The GPS said she lived about an hour away. When I first started to talk to her, she told me that she lived in a nice neighborhood. But when I got there were people everywhere and the neighborhood was not that nice. When I stopped at the stop sign at the corner, people walked up to my windows and asked me what do I need. But I pulled off really fast and got to the house. It was a duplex, so I messaged her and she said to come up the stairs. It was about 9 at night and people were everywhere just standing around. I knocked on the door and I was definitely excited. The door opened and to my surprise, it was a bald-headed white guy with a patchy beard, tattoos everywhere including his head with a tank top on. I asked was Lisa home and he said, yeah, come in. When I walked in, I was immediately hit with a musty smell mixed with cheese. He told me to sit down and he sat down across from me on the couch. He said she'll be out soon. He asked me did I want something to drink and I said, yeah, sure. When I got up, I texted her, can she come out please? She immediately said yes. The man came back in with 2 cups of juice, one for him and one for myself. Then I noticed that he put a phone down on the table next to him. So I acted like I sneezed and got some on my arm. Then I asked for a tissue. He went to get some tissue and he left his phone like I thought he would. I texted her back and to my horror, the phone rang. I looked on the caller ID and it was my name. I heard him coming back. He came back and we sat there for about a minute. And then the phone rang again because he never checked the message that I sent. He looked at the phone. I looked at the phone. Then we looked at each other. I postured up and he calmly said, I guess you caught me. Then out of nowhere, he lunged toward me, attempting to grab me. I punched him and he fell on his face. I ran out of there so fast and I never looked back. Yeah, I called the cops. And when they got there, the man was still knocked out. After that, I never went on dates with people that I met online again.
I was 10 years old, and I was home alone. But that wasn't a big deal because we lived in a small city. My mom and dad were at my grandma's house. I couldn't go because I was sick. It was around 9 p.m. when I was about to go to sleep. My room was really small, and it only had one window facing my bed. That window to me was kind of scary, because when you're a little kid, your imagination can sometimes go wild. At that time, it wasn't my imagination, though. Like I said, I was about to go to bed when I heard a loud scream coming from outside. It was really scary, but I tried to be quiet so I could listen to what was going on outside. Nothing was happening, though. It was really quiet, like nothing had happened at all. Quieter than normal, actually. Some time had passed, and everything seemed okay, so I just laid down and tried to sleep. 1 hour later, I heard that loud scream again, but this time, it seemed to be closer. I froze. I was so freaked out I couldn't even move. 30 minutes later, again, the same scream. At that point, I was about to cry. I don't know why, but that scream wasn't just a scream. It was at this high pitch, and it was just so creepy. Finally, 15 minutes later, I saw something at that window. It was a really skinny woman, and she seemed so happy for some reason. She was smiling, and her smile was so big and creepy. When I saw her, I started crying, and she started screaming again. I was horrified. She was just looking at me, smiling and screaming for the whole night. The next morning, my parents came back home, and I told them everything. They called the police, and the police found out that my window, that was facing my bed, was broken. But it didn't seem like it was broken with some sort of weapon, but as if it were broken by a really high pitch.
It was a beautiful day in August. My family and I had just finished packing for our trip. We were bored and hadn't planned to do anything because our trip was in a couple of days. So we all decided to go to the Safari Zoo place because it was only an hour drive and a great way to kill time. When we got there and we noticed that there were a bunch of people at the zoo, my family could get impatient of this, so we asked the receptionist if there was anything we could do that wasn't too busy. Lucky for us, there were private tours. They were a bit expensive, but the lady assured us that the tour guides were highly educated and great at their job. We were given animal food and introduced to our private tour guide. When we first saw our tour guide, we noticed he was a little off. He had a weird lisp, didn't speak very much English, and had a really bad lazy eye. When my dad first tried to greet him, he ignored my dad and gestured us to one of the safari minivans. We were a little taken aback, but didn't think anything of it. Once we got into the van, we noticed that there was a bad smell and a bunch of animal food on the floor. He started driving before we could get our seatbelts on. We first passed by lions and hyenas. It was all really cool. There were also a bunch of vans and tour buses behind and in front of us that were taking all the attention of the animals. Out of the blue, the tour guide turned onto a trail that no other buses or vans were going on. My dad got a little suspicious and asked the tour guide where we were going. The tour guide replied with elephants, shortly because once again he didn't know English very well. Well, we really wanted to see the elephants at that time, so we all got excited. After a good 10 minutes of driving, we noticed that we had seen no animals and no other tour guides, just a never-ending forest. My mom, who has paranoia, was getting worried and repeatedly asked the tour guide where he was going. But then, he never answered. All of a sudden, he stopped the car and said he had to get something from the back of his car. My dad was getting red flags and watched him from the rearview mirror. And then, my dad hopped into the driver's seat, locked all the doors immediately, and pressed the accelerator to the floor. With a fearful face that I've never seen before like that, we were all slammed into the backs of our seats. "What's going on?" my mom yelled. "I saw him holding an axe," my dad yelled back. We made it back to the safari and to the receptionist. We explained the whole situation and she called the police. They had a long search and finally he got caught after a few hours. We got a full refund and later found out that our tour guide didn't even work at the safari but used a fake ID. And had history linked with murder, kidnapping, and other crimes we won't mention. We also found out the reason that the car smelled so bad was because the tour guide admitted to killing multiple safari animals and taking them home. To this day, I still wonder what would have happened if my dad didn't look in the rearview mirror when the tour guide stopped the car.
This is not about my story, but someone from my church, and he wanted to share his experience with anyone else. He's a 32-year-old man, and his pseudonym is Mark. He's a fairly big guy, and this situation took place when he was on his way home from work. He said that he had lost his phone 1 week before this whole situation happened, so he couldn't call and get any help during this story. It was quite late, around 11 p.m. He had finished work and was walking to a taxi stop location, and when he got there, A few people were standing around waiting as well. After about 2 minutes, he noticed that there was a minivan approaching. Usually, minivans are cheaper than taxis, and he felt tired that day, so he decided to take the minivan. He sat on a seat, and there was a young boy seated in the passenger side next to the driver who was collecting the fare. And then, 2 other boys who looked like teenagers also boarded the minivan and sat in the seats in front of him. Once the minivan took off, after about 5 minutes, the boy asked if they would like to drink some Coke. The boys accepted and started drinking. And they also gave it to Mark. Mark was also feeling thirsty, so he took it, but only a sip. Not much later, he started feeling drowsy. Just before he about laid his head on the seat beside him, he noticed that those 2 boys were already knocked out. After he laid his head down, he heard noises coming from the back seats. 2 people were talking in a different language. The car was passing a big signboard that showed Crest Chicken Farm. And then he finally passed out. When he got up, he found himself inside a big shed-like barn, and there were some tools on a big table. He was on the floor, and the other 2 teenage boys were laying next to him. He still felt a bit drowsy, but he managed to get himself up as he was looking for an escape. He saw that the 2 boys were still passed out, so he tried waking them, but they wouldn't budge. As Mark was kind of a big man, he tried to see if he could carry one of them, but it was hard to do because even Mark was having a hard time to stand properly. And then he heard voices. He took a peek from the door, and 3 people were walking toward the big shed, coming from a house on the hill, which was quite close to the shed. Mark panicked and tried to look for another exit. He was looking around the place, and he found one at the end of the shed, luckily. He approached quietly and escaped as fast as he could. At this point, his vision was all blurry, but he managed to find a fence door and unlocked it. He heard the people shouting, but he ignored. He just kept on running. When he finally reached his house, it was early morning, around 5 a.m. His wife was up all night waiting for him and ran out the front door as soon as she saw him. He collapsed and slept for almost the whole day. When he woke up and finally got a chance to explain to his wife what had transpired that night, he remembered about the other 2 boys who were still there. Then he contacted the police immediately. He told the police about the road signs and a big billboard for Crest Chicken Farm and other things that he could remember. About 2 weeks after, there was a police report about how they found 2 teenage boys' bodies in a lake and advised that when they examined the bodies, all their organs were missing. Mark just stood in fear. And as the event was too traumatic for him, Mark had to quit a job for a while.
When I was a kid, I was really into paranormal things such as ghosts and spirits, so I always got really excited for Halloween. On one Halloween, my parents took me and my brother to a ghost tour in the city. During the tour, we would visit real haunted houses, which were said to have some really violent ghosts. I couldn't be more excited. We arrived at the location for the tour meetup, an empty parking lot, but we were a bit early and nobody else had arrived yet. It was a chilly October night, so my parents decided that we should find a building to wait in until more people arrive. We walked over to the building that the parking lot was meant for, an old hotel, and entered the vestibule. We tried to fully enter the building, but we found that the doors leading to the lobby inside were locked. After a few minutes of standing around, I started to feel strange. A nauseous feeling had swept my stomach. Goosebumps ran up and down my arms, and a piercing feeling of being watched was stabbing, almost burning my back. Looking around, it was obvious that me and my family were the only ones inside the vestibule. The lobby of the building was also devoid of people. Once we saw people enter the parking lot, we left, and I felt better. And after that, I was shocked to see the first place we stopped on the tour was the building my family had been waiting in. Now, this building we won't enter, because the spirit inside here is more violent than the others will encounter, the guide stated. In here, we have the Shadow Man. He doesn't terrorize the whole building, just the area that you enter through. He's been known to slap and scratch people coming inside. A few pictures were passed around. All of a sudden, I don't know how and why, but I recognized that an inky black figure stood against the door's windows. Its eyes were glowing white, and it had long fingers and pointed nails. It was freaky to think that I might have been targeted by the Shadow Man, but I didn't think much of it until after the tour when my family went back home. I started to complain to my mom that my back was itching and burning, so she grabbed some ointment and told me she would look at it. We thought it was just a bug bite. We had been walking around outside at night after all. When she lifted my shirt, she asked when I had scratched my back. I told her I hadn't. She took a picture on her phone and showed it to me. I was met with a long red scratch leading from my shoulder to the middle of my back. The skin on my back was a shade of red, like a rash. Me and all of my family couldn't say anything, but just turned back straight to our house. The Shadow Man had got me.